Alright folks, here we are with the Charioteer. This is the new Tier 8 British turreted tank destroyer. And we've ended up on Sand River. As I said, Tier 8 is a lot more filled than Tier 6 on the test server. Mostly by people trying out the various premiums, which I'm not going to complain about. So the Charioteer is largely a similar tank to the Challenger before it. Again, it's based on the chassis of a Cromwell medium tank, or a cruiser tank in British terminology. And I was tabbed out just at the beginning of this match, which is why I'm sitting still. The turret looks a little less stupid, I'll give it that. It actually looks like a, it's a nice vehicle. It's got some nice lines to it. So I think this is going to be definitely a keeper, just on the basis of looking cool. You may notice the gun. If that looks familiar, there's a good reason. That is the L7A1 105mm gun, which is a Tier 10 medium tank gun. That's right, this is the gun from the Centurion and the 4202. That means we have 268mm penetration APCR as our default ammunition in a Tier 8 tank destroyer. Let that sink in for a moment. Not only that, but we also have the 210mm penetration, 480 average damage Hesh round as our gold ammo. Now, remember, this is a Tier 8, and in Tier 8, you see Tier 6s, and I can't think of a single Tier 6 that has 210mm of armor. And as you can actually see here, the gun depression is giving me some woes. This is something you're going to have to get used to as you move up the new tank destroyer line. The gun depression only gets worse from here, just because the size of the guns relative to the size of the chassis they're mounted on makes it impossible to get good depression out of. It's worth noting though that the turret is actually quite low profile, especially compared to the later vehicles, and it does traverse quite quickly. And again, it's on the Cromwell chassis, so you hit 52 kilometers an hour top speed. It's not as maneuverable as the medium tank Cromwell, the actual proper Cromwell, but it's good enough. I'm not sure how this thing's camo is. It's probably not that great, but it's, I'd imagine, not the worst. Probably better than the Jagdpanther 2s. Of course, all the new TDs and Lend-Lease tanks are in HD models. They look very, very, very nice. Lots of nice details like dented fenders and so on. Now, the gun handling for this gun, as with the Challenger and as with all the subsequent tank destroyers in this line, the gun handling is absolutely atrocious. The aim time's not half bad. The accuracy is of course good. It's an L7A1. The problem is the moment you move or traverse your turret, it blows out your aim something fierce. Kind of like the Object 430 or the Batchat. It's not as accurate in practice as it is on paper. And then again, I don't know if I'd call either of those tanks accurate on paper either. Hit points wise, 1050 hit points, you actually have the same hit point pool as the Comet. Or roughly the same hit point pool as the Comet anyway. So that's an interesting thing to note. It's about average for Tier 8 tank destroyers, remembering that they tend to lag a bit behind their other compatriots in terms of hit points. And you've got weirdo cases like the Object 416, which has the hit points of a tank destroyer, even though it's technically a medium tank. It even behaves like a tank destroyer. So even though the accuracy on the move is quite bad, you can still pull off snapshots at close range, and because of your high speed and just good general handling, as in driving handling, not gun handling, you can pull off some pretty bullshit things, as I did here. This gun at Tier 8 is just so good. Tier 10 guns on Tier 8 tank destroyers are nothing new. Of course, there are the very old examples of the... I'm going to do something stupid here and get myself blown up. Yep. Of the BL-10 and the 128mm gun on both the Ferdinand and the Jagdpanther 2. So, Tier 10 guns and Tier 8 TDs is nothing new. However, Tier 10 medium guns, which typically have pretty high rates of fire and very high penning rounds that shoot nice and flat, with great muzzle velocity. You know, the alphas are not as high as a BL-10 or a 128, but this gun is just, like, this is a good gun at tier 9 and 10. This is a gun that you really, like, Hesh is fine as a gold round because there are a few things you will not pen with 268mm pen APCR round as default. This is now on a tier 8, and you know, as much as I'm going to enjoy playing this thing, and as much as I'd rather be facing probably one of these than a BL-10, at least at a BL-10 at a range where he's likely to hit me, this is getting kind of worrying because this keeps happening. Wargaming are constantly reducing tier 10 guns down to tier 9 mediums, tier 8 tank destroyers. It's starting to be a problem. This is the kind of power creep that caused a lot of tanks to become irrelevant. This is the reason the Löwe is basically just nobody wants to buy it anymore, because, you know, there's so many high pen guns now that C tier 8s, it just butchers it. The tier 9 mediums with tier 10 guns are just barely on the verge of being balanced, I think. Because they have, you know, long reloads. In the case of the Wheezy 120, it also has atrocious gun depression and pretty poor handling. But the tier 9s with the tier 10 guns, the new generation tier 9s like the Cent and the Wheezy 120, those are some really capable tanks, and if you actually see how they fare in the hands of really good players, not average players, but actual really good players, it's pretty obvious that Wargaming are kind of towing the line of what they should and shouldn't be doing with regards to balance. It's just, I mean, the average puppy might not be able to fully utilize a tier 10 gun to just wreck a whole team, but I couldn't even imagine playing my Cent without the L7A1 now. It's such a powerful gun. It is the greatest equalizer you could imagine. When you're staring down a tier 10 and you know as well as he does you could put a hole straight through him. So I'm hoping this trend doesn't continue, although I'm sure it will. I'm going to just rest in the hopes that no new TD lines are added for a while, because if a tank does get a very powerful gun at a low tier, it tends to be the TDs that do it, obviously because TDs by their nature have more powerful guns than heavy tanks or mediums in the same tier. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. I don't mind having a couple of vehicles in the game with drastically, not overpowered, but under-tiered guns, but there's a very fine line that has to be carefully navigated here to make sure it doesn't completely throw out the balance of the game and end up power creeping a bunch more tanks into irrelevance. Like, power creep needs to be arrested and, if possible, reversed. It doesn't need to be accelerated. But that's enough about power creep. Let's talk more about this tank and the ones that follow it. So this thing, I think, is going to be a keeper. It looks good, which is the most important stat, obviously. It's quite fun to play, even with, you know, ping issues and being on test and just not really being used to it. It does seem like it's going to be a fun vehicle. It's not your typical snipey hide and back TD. It's also not an assault gun. It's sort of this, it's almost like a Hellcat, except with really bad gun handling. Although now with the Hellcat being nerfed into the ground, the Hellcat also has a really bad gun handling. Yeah, these are like British Hellcats, actually. So I'm okay with that, actually. I quite like the Charioteer. So I definitely recommend it. If you liked the Hellcat before it got nerfed, you will probably like this thing. I mean, this gun, you can't beat this gun. You can't say no to it. There's nothing in the game, really, that this won't pen. You might have trouble against things like hull-down JPs or IS-7s or whatever, but I mean, if you pick your shots, you can pen any tank with this gun. And 390 Alpha being put out every 10 seconds is nothing to sneer at. I should note that this thing has about the same rate of fire as the Tier 9 Centurion, which, you know, the Centurion has like the bare minimum rate of fire that makes this gun balanced on a Tier 9 medium, so this thing's... Whoa. I really like this. I'm kind of worried about the precedent it sets for the game. So, there might actually be some more reasons to play tier 8 in the future, at least if you plan on going down this line. If you don't plan on going down this line, you might have less reasons to play tier 8 in the future. This line in general seems to be a lot more tolerable, a lot more fun, and not necessarily easier to play, but easier to grind than the AT whatever line going all the way down to the Tortoise. Now the Tortoise is a great tank destroyer. It's slow and ponderous and a big target, but it vomits hatred and death. I absolutely adore the Tortoise from playing it on test. The problem is I don't have the patience to grind through the whole line to get to it, and it is literally the only tank out of that entire line I give a shit about. The 183 I could take or leave, especially now that the 4005 is basically it, but better. I'll talk more about that in the video where I featured the 4005, which will be coming up actually after this one. But yeah, this is a much easier line to go down, so if you don't want to suffer through the misery of playing the AT2, the AT8, the AT7, the AT15, the fucking... and then finally get up to the Tortoise, you might want to try this line instead. And then just, you know, free XP the Tortoise at a later date or something. I should also note that the Charioteer is where the chassis changes. So this one still has the Cromwell chassis after it goes to Centurion, and that's where it stays for the remaining 2 tank destroyers. Now, rather than tacking this into the 4005 video, I'll do it here, even though this video is starting to get a bit long. I haven't had a chance to get a decent match in the Conway yet, which is the tier 9 that follows after this. The Conway is basically the same theory on a Centurion hull, so it's a Cent hull, you know, big bobblehead turret, actually quite a tall turret, bigger than this one, with the 120mm gun off the Conqueror in it. That's a very fucking good gun. It does lose some of the speed and agility of the Centurion. The Centurion wasn't the fastest tank to begin with, but it was pretty agile. It's lost a bit of that. It's not bad. It's not really, you know, slow as molasses heavy tank kind of mobility, but it's certainly not as surprisingly sprightly as the Centurion is. It's a large target, it's an unarmored target. None of these turrets really have much armor on them, so you can't afford to try and tank hits. The gun is spectacular, and as it is on Conqueror, it's extremely accurate and aims extremely quickly. So that hasn't changed. It's still a laser cannon. The thing that has changed is that it's only a laser cannon if you're sitting perfectly still and not traversing around. Whereas the Conqueror and the 215B are perfectly accurate on the move. In fact, there's barely any difference between close range on the move firing and long range sniping for those 2 tanks. The Conway is atrociously inaccurate when it's moving or traversing its turret. Like 215B 183 levels of inaccurate. It's just, the bloom is so bad. The KV2 would probably be better at shooting on the move than the Conway. So although you do have this very accurate fast aiming gun, it needs to be fired from a stationary position or you're not going to hit a fucking thing. Otherwise the Conway very much plays like this, pretty much. It's a very mobile, powerful, pretty accurate gun, but you can't really do the shooting on the move thing. And it's also not quite as fast as this, so I guess the Hellcat comparison kind of wears off a bit with the Conway, but it's the same theory, you know, it's just a mobile chassis for shuttling a giant gun around, as opposed to, say, the JP100 or the Ferdinand, which is not meant to be mobile. It's just a giant armored shit brick with a giant gun on it. Anyway, so yeah, that's basically the Conway. If I do get a chance, I will upload a video of it, but for now, I haven't been able to get a decent match in it. Either I've just ended up in shitty matches that I didn't really get to do much, or I got blown up right at the start again because high ping and being unfamiliar with the tank. So, I'm going to cut this here before it gets any longer, and I will see you on the next one, which will be the 4005, the new tier 10. Thanks for watching.